Hello everyone and welcome back to Arsenal Pass. Hayden here with a preview video for the Calling Indianapolis happening this weekend. But I'm not alone to do it. I'm joined by someone that you may be familiar with at this point, and if you're not, well, you better get used to seeing his face. You're going to see a lot of him this weekend in the booth for the Calling Indianapolis, calling all the plays. It's Bryan Gottlieb. Bryan, in all honesty, one of my favorite people in TCGs, and I'm honored that you accepted my call to come on and do this with me in preparation for the calling this weekend.
I told you, Hayden, you are my flesh and blood Sherpa. I owe Arsenal Pass a lot. Y'all got me grounded, ready to go, understanding flesh and blood. You were my onboarding process. So whenever you need something from me, you just let me know. I got your back.
Well, you know, I think I sent a message to you 20 minutes later. There was an enthusiastic yes to do this, and less than 48 hours later, we're sat here doing it. Gonna talk all things Classic Constructed as we head into the Calling Indianapolis. Of course, you'll be calling all the plays there. For those that maybe aren't as familiar, of course, you were on the channel last year. We did a time in the round with you, but maybe just a quick, 101 of Bryan and a bit about how you came to be sitting in the chair that you're going to be sitting in this weekend, just in case people don't know you.
Well, there's nothing I hate more than introductions, so I'm going to keep that part super short. I'm just a random TCG person, mostly Magic the Gathering, did a bunch of broadcasting over there, make a bunch of content, written content. I have a podcast, Arena Decklist. You might have heard of that if you're a Magic fan. And how I ended up in the booth, I kind of just angrily tweeted. I was just, sometimes you just say what you're thinking. And I was just like, man, there's all these awesome Flesh and Blood tournaments coming up. I love this game. I know how much Flesh and Blood cares about presentation of their game, how much they know like a quality commentary team can add to the mix. And I also know that my previous broadcast partner over on the SCG Tour, Craig Krempels, devoted Flesh and Blood player as well. Just missed top 8 at US Nationals. Just actually yesterday secured his PTI, so he's going to be at Pro Tour New Jersey as a player. And I just tweeted, I was like, if only there was somebody out there, an experienced commentary team who was comfortable in the booth, who had the reps, and also happened to love Flesh and Blood and had worked with each other a bunch and tons of hours together. Of course, snarkily describing myself and Craig. And it was maybe a month later that I got the call from Star City, and they were like, are you interested in doing this? I said 100%. Also, what about Craig? And they were like, yeah, we're already talking to Craig. Don't worry about that. So it all worked out, and we're going to get to call some Flesh and Blood, and I am stoked for it.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Tannen, of course, returning to the booth this weekend as well, alongside yourself
Absolutely.
and Craig. So it's going to be a pretty memorable trio, I think. I can't make it. I'm not going to be there in Indianapolis, but I will be sat at home. I will be glued to the broadcast and watching all the action unfold, which is exactly what we're going to talk about in this as well. What we expect to see, the decks to look out for, heroes to look out for. We're even going to talk about some of the players to look out for, cards to look out for. But before that, I thought let's talk a little bit about what the calling is, in case people out there may have not gone to a calling before. Maybe they're going to be there this week in Indianapolis or watching from home.
First calling. This is my first calling, so I'm right there with them.
Exactly, Bryan's first calling. So pretty interesting weekend. We've got a 2-day event with the calling, right? So it's Saturday, Sunday. It's Classic Constructed, right, Bryan, that people are going to be playing over the course of this weekend?
Yes, sir.
Friday, though. Friday's actually a Blitz event. So I don't know. Are you going to be playing in this event, Bryan, yourself?
I have some production stuff. We have some production meetings. And by the way, I should take this opportunity to mention, having worked with Star City a bunch, who is putting on this tournament, they're really good on the production side. They care about what they present. They've put a lot of work into their Flesh and Blood setups, into the back end stuff that you don't really think about when you're watching the broadcast. But what I'm telling you is it's going to be a pretty beautiful broadcast, hopefully with some high quality matches. So I think that's a huge plus as well. Not to discount any of the work anyone else has done in the space. I think everyone is also doing so much to push Flesh and Blood forward. But I'm excited to see what Star City can do with this stuff, and I think all the viewers are going to be too.
Yeah. Coverage starting from Saturday, but on Friday there is a bit of a warm-up event. There is a Team Blitz beatdown, which is, I think, the first time that this has been done. I know at previous callings there's been like Blitz events, but it's been just regular 1v1. There was a team sealed event that I actually got to play in Auckland going back mid last year. But this is the first time that we have a more set out sort of event. On the Friday, there's prize tickets up for grabs. People can grab their friends, teammates, and play this. 3 people playing in a team. You can all communicate with one another. I know you're very familiar with team events in MTG. I love team events, so I'm excited that this is starting to happen. I hope we see this for like a pro tour or calling format in the future as well.
No, it's a really cool setup, and I think the more LSS can do to offer like these diverse experiences, there's something special about like sitting down with your teammates and sharing the results, and bringing that type of stuff to the game is such a huge boon for them. And I also think it's cool they're doing it with the Blitz format. I mean, Blitz, from what I can tell, is garnering a mixed reputation among people. You either love it or you hate it. I could see like the format needing some normalizing as time goes on. It's certainly very high variance, very swingy, but it's cool in that way. Like, it's exciting, especially when you have it in the team context, because all those wild things like the Kano turn 0 wins, you're going to share that with your teammates, right? And that kind of makes it more exciting and even more tolerable because it doesn't dictate the entire match. You have 2 other teammates out there battling. So
yeah, it's a great point. Those kind of, I guess, more variance heavy games, or a format that is maybe by some seen as variance heavy, you get to offset that a little bit with this best 2 out of 3 with your teammates. And yeah, I mean, what better to share? You, like you say, a turn 0 Kano kill, or a turn 1 Rhinar kill with the quad intimidate off an alpha rampage than with your 2 of your best friends sitting next to you, or 2 of your teammates, or even just 2 people that you've met maybe this week and formed a team together. It's a pretty awesome experience. So got that on Friday. Of course, SCG, with the big SCG Con event, there's other things happening around the weekend as well for other games as well. It's not just Flesh and Blood. But then on Saturday, we have the main event, which you'll, of course, be calling. That's going to be 7 to 9 rounds of Swiss on day 1. That's going to depend on the attendance of players. So minimum will be 7 rounds, maximum will be 9 rounds based on the attendance. And then there's going to be a cut at the end of day 2, right? So all players who are X or 2 record, so they have maximum 2 losses, are going to go through to day 2. Or the top 64 players, so the greater of those 2, are going to go through and get a shot to play on day 2 in this event. Day 2 is another 5 rounds of Swiss, which again, you'll be back in the booth there, Brian, calling those. And then at the end of that, they're going to cut to the top 8. So somewhere between 12 and 14 rounds that we're going to get to see on camera before we even get to the top 8 and to the nitty gritty, the single elimination, where we see who's going to take that trophy on Sunday.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm so excited. So I came to Flesh and Blood at the tail end of Monarch. My first full season was sort of Tales of Aria season, where I played mostly limited throughout that season. I was still getting my decks together and things like that. So this is the first constructed metagame I've really gotten to fully dig my teeth in, where I just I'm in the trenches. I'm building decks. I'm understanding everything. Finally, at this point, I feel like a competent player. I feel like everything's well within my range at this point. I'm comfortable playing basically every hero. And to get to call it, and for my first calling experience, to get to actually call the matches, that's a dream for me. Like, I love being on that side of things. My competitive days, I'm getting older now. I don't care as much as I need to, I think, to really reach the apex of the competitive scene. Like, I'm very happy if my opponent's happy, basically, at this point. So if you ask me for a concession, you just might get it from me some of the time. I just be like, yeah, go ahead. It matters more to you. But from the calling side of things, from being in the booth and presenting this stuff, I absolutely eat it up. So I'm stoked to be a part of this.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Craig Krempels, you just talked about, took his PTI, took a ProQuest win this weekend. You came very close to a top 8, 9th on Breakers, and the only ProQuest that you were able to make this season. And Tannen, I know, has been putting in the work as well to learn as much as possible and continue to get better at this game. He, another person who, until he picked up the coverage side just a few months ago, late last year, hadn't played the game before. But now we have a very experienced trio sitting in the booth. So yeah, I'm excited to hear how you call these plays. And
so I have to get your perspective on that, Hayden, as you being a welcome to Wraith boomer and being around forever. I mean, what do you think about folks like Craig, Tannen, and I coming in and taking on these roles where our experience doesn't extend as deep as you are? Are you concerned about our ability to present the game and know the history of the game, or do you think we've kind of shown our dedication and you're comfortable with having the game in our hands at this point? You can be honest. I don't mind if you want to bash me now. It's your show.
Well, Tannen, that's a different story. But no,
right.
no.
You always got to worry about Tannen a little bit.
No, in all honesty, I think I said this to you before, Brian. I'm super excited. I was waiting for you to finally do some coverage from Flesh and Blood, and a big part of that is because I've seen the work that you've done in other games, in Magic in particular. And one of the big things for me is that, I know that you've been playing this game. I know you've been pretty invested in this basically from the first time you picked up a Katsu deck and started jamming with it. And I know Craig, a result on the weekend speaks for itself. Clearly knows the game. So not only do we have 3 very experienced casters in the booth this weekend, but some players who can hold their own as well. So that's for me is a really important part of it, is to have that blend of the experience and the knowledge of how these productions run, but also the ability to actually call the game and know the game in depth. And I think that's, for me, that's in all honesty very exciting. Except for Tannen. No, I'm kidding. I love Tannen.
We all love Tannen, and we all have to pick on him. I don't know why. It's just something about Tannen. You just want to give him a little rib, but we all love him. I'm really happy to hear that. It means a lot to me. I think one of the things is that I wouldn't want to do this if I didn't think like everyone involved loved the game. And this extends to like the production team at Star City. Like they all are just head over heels, like, excited to do this, which is like, I didn't know what I would be walking into come production meeting. Like, are they completely still focused on Magic? Are they moving into Flesh and Blood? No, they all love the game. They're playing it all the time too. And I think knowing how, certainly it's going to be presented solely as a game of Flesh and Blood. It's not like, oh, that's just like this Magic game I called back in 2010. There won't be any of that going on. But I think knowing how to like bring that audience in and how to present the game to them and what really works from a coverage standpoint is going to be super valuable as we just like expand this Flesh and Blood player base, which is very clearly happening in my experience. It's also one of the things I'm excited about for this event. Like, I want to see all these old Magic heads starting to float over, and they are. Like, the more people I talk to, the more people who are just like, yeah, I tried it. You're right. It's dope. I'm going to be at the Calling. I can't wait to play. And it just keeps happening over and over.
Well, we're going to talk about some players to watch out for at the end, and I know there's a few Magic players or ex-Magic players in the ranks that have already put up some results that we're going to talk about. But the big thing as well, you just talked about the player base growing. There's a pretty sizable pot on the line in terms of prizes this weekend as well. There's $20,000 in cash being given out across, all the way down to 32nd is cash out. So the winner is going to pick up one of those coveted gold foil tunics that the Calling winners have picked up. There's only a couple of those left.
Many left.
No, there's only a couple. I think this one and then Taiwan and maybe New Jersey. Those are the last 3 to give out from what Alex has said. So very coveted prize. There's also, gold foil legendaries for the top 8 of the Calling. As well as those cash prizes. And importantly, really importantly for a lot of these players as well, is there's PTIs on the line. Top-8ing this Calling can get you to New Jersey or perhaps Pro Tour 2 or even Worlds. So there's a lot on the line for trying to make that top 8. But all the way down to 32nd as well is cash prizing, which I think is a really good incentive for making that cut to day 2 and to continue to strive to try and get to those levels.
No, absolutely. And I'm super stoked to see what the numbers actually look like. I could see it being down from like Vegas peak just because it's limited versus constructed, and people are still getting their collections together. And I don't know that like everyone has the cards they need to play at this point. But for the first big constructed Calling in the US, I don't know. I think the numbers might surprise. Based on what I'm hearing, based on people I'm talking to, I think the numbers might come back really good.
Yeah, well, I was in Orlando for that weekend, and that was constructed as well, plus US Nationals.
Right, that's true.
2 events in one, which, there's a lot of incentive to travel to those, because even if you don't do well in US Nationals, you've got the Calling next day. I think that was that 700-odd players, 600-odd players. So, I could easily see that being that this weekend. And then, of course, we've got New Jersey, which I'm expecting to be massive in terms of that Calling and Pro Tour weekend.
Everyone I talk to is like, well, I'm going to New Jersey.
Yeah.
So
Same, yeah.
Yes, I think it will be massive.
I think half the community here in Australia who play Flesh and Blood are going, and that is a crazy thing to think that they're going to hit over a PTI or not. So awesome to see. Sunday as well, at this coming weekend in Indianapolis, we do have a Battle Hardened, which does award more PTIs. So 2 PTIs given out in that event. So perhaps those that don't make day 2 in the Calling enter into the Battle Hardened. Again, that's class constructed. Finalists receiving those PTIs and a gold foil legendary for the winner as well. Plus, there's actually the first time with these PTI events, these Sunday events, now with the Battle Hardened banner with 2 PTIs, one for each of the finalists. There's also cash prizes as well, which is a really nice thing to help people get to those events as well once they do potentially win a PTI.
Yeah, absolutely. The stakes are all very reasonable. We're not at the life-changing money space yet, but we're at the good money stage for sure, and you'll be very happy to walk away with any of those prizes.
For sure. All right, I think we should get into it and talk about, the metagame, this classic constructed. We're in a really interesting spot right now where, I don't know if you realize this, I just looked before, we're less than 6 weeks removed from the release of Everfest. It doesn't feel like that because we've just come through a ProQuest season where we've had over 300 events. there's quite a bit of data there available, and there's a lot of, I
Yeah.
guess, information that actually we can talk about in terms of what this meta looks like. I think about the Monarch meta prior to this. By the time we got even to the Road to National season, I think we were 2 months, 2.5 months removed from the release, and that meta really took a lot of time to ramp up. Feels like this is kind of a big change in how Flesh and Blood is working, and coming in line with maybe other TCGs in terms of just the rate of change and how quickly we get to. I wouldn't say that we're at the full development of a meta, but we're on the cycle up, right? So we've got a few things to talk about from this information, this data that we have. What's kind of been your first takeaway from this 4 weeks of ProQuest season? Like, what has been the standout to you? What's the story for you as we head into Indianapolis when it comes to the meta and the heroes?
It's got to be Bravo star of the show. I don't think you can start talking about this format without going there. And I think you're exactly right. The development of this deck, the pace feels very accelerated from sort of the last constructed metas we saw. I think people were on it early. I was among them. It was very clear this was a special thing to do, but sort of not in the way it ended up working out. I just thought having this card pool had to be exploitable, essentially. Such a huge card pool offers so many possibilities. And it turns out the hero ability is just sort of absurd as well. So I don't know how you start the conversation without talking about Bravo, and then it sort of fills in to that triangle. Although I will say I'm skeptical of the idea we actually have a triangle at this point. I think we have two decks. And that's not to say there's only two viable options. I think we have two best decks. And then there are cascading options below that. And sort of the idea that there was this triangle. And of course, if you're not familiar, the triangle is Bravo, Prism, Viserai. I think that might have stopped some of the development of other decks because it's really difficult to account for all three of those things. And yes, it's very difficult to account for just Prism and Bravo. They're incredible decks, incredibly strong. But where you're sort of like, okay, maybe I can actually afford to give up some points to the Rune Blades, and that's not what I have to be concerned about right now. I do think it starts opening up other possibilities further down the metagame. And we're very much in the point now where we spent a lot of time refining that triangle. And now we have to start seeing the things that can pull off of it. And I think that takes really, really strong, not only players, but deck builders, because you have to be able to identify how you're going to interact with these powerful things. And you can't do it on power rate. It's not going to work. You're just not going to find cards that are as powerful as the combination of cards that Bravo and Prism can present to you. So where do you go? And I think there's several good answers to that, quite frankly.
Yeah, I'm just checking. I don't remember sharing my notes with you on this, but it seems like you've taken the words right out of my mouth. I feel that the exact same way, kind of on that perceived idea of that triangle, right? To me, it really feels like, yeah, honestly, there's two decks right now that if I'm going into this metagame, it's Prism and Bravo. You look at the results from ProQuest season, Bravo is by far and away, I think, winning 43% of ProQuest up to week 3. But Prism's around there at about 24% as well. But it's a big drop off to Viserai. It's almost it's less than half the wins of Prism when you get to Viserai, and after that you're looking at decks like Lexi and I think Chain actually, then Lexi. So there is, like you say, there's options out there, but does the idea of how you play into this meta really start to change once you stop thinking potentially about, equally Bravo, Prism, Viserai? Maybe it's more Bravo, Prism, and then you start to think about some of the Rune Blades. So with all that said, one of the things I really want to do with this preview is dive into these perceived, at least the big two, but also the big three. And as we talk through these, we're actually going to pop up some deck lists so we can talk through some of the key cards and what these heroes are trying to do. But I know you've played Bravo in this ProQuest season, so why don't you give us a little bit about what Bravo is trying to do with these current builds in this meta?
Yeah, so I'm going to be careful to talk about the broader Bravo builds. Mine deviates a little bit. I wrote an article, if you want to see it, arenadecklist.gg. I wrote all about my own Bravo Star of the Show list, which is a little bit more focused on Earthlore Bounty. I still think it's really good. I'm not trying to sell anyone on it before we head to the calling, but, take a look. But the standard setup for Bravo, you're just getting your elemental ratios right, heavily focused on blues, and trying to come at your opponent with both haymakers, but also a really high floor. Like, even your bad turns is Bravo, where you're just loaded with blues. You've still got that break ground, and you're fusing it, and that's still like a nice attack. It was 7 with Go Again, and then you load up the hammer, and you haven't spent all that many resources on doing so. You have an arsenal going forward from a turn like that. That's the low side of your fuse turns. So when these decks are built to efficiently fuse over and over, the output is just so good. And then there's the additional angle of Awakening. And Awakening is a card that I find so fascinating because it's kind of like simultaneously over-respected and under-respected. And that's a weird thing to say, but I think in the matchups and situations where it's good, it's so good. Absolutely game-breaking, can turn a game on its head, like that. But I also think people expect it to always be good. And that's not the case. There's a lot, to me, of play draw variants, like that turn one where you're on the draw and you get that free Awakening. There's nothing better. Like, that's just such a free roll in so many scenarios. And then there's also just matchup considerations. Like, it's huge in the mirror. We all know that taking advantage of the huge pulverized turn can be a big deal. But I think there's other matchups where it's either over or underrepresented. And I'm really going to be watching Awakening closely to see what players think of it, because I know opinions are all over the place. Some people think you need it in every matchup. Some people think you never sideboard out your last Awakening. You always have at least one in the deck for catch-up potential. And there's some people like myself that are very comfortable playing without Awakening in some spots. And so much of it is like, what other decisions did you make in deck building? Because it's all intertwined, and that will always influence how good Awakening is. But everyone has such varying opinions on it, where like we all agree it's good, but nobody can decide exactly how good it is.
Yeah. I mean, even personally, I've fluctuated between the card giving me nightmares to, like you say, a card that I'm not playing in certain matchups because of how I want to sideboard, how I want to approach the game plan in those matchups. So I'm really excited to see how some of the best players in North America and abroad, we're going to have some players from abroad, do so with this deck in Indianapolis. But we've thrown the deck list up on the screen here, and if we talk about some of the interesting things, to me, one of the most interesting things is that these lists typically over 40 cards of the the base 60 that you're probably playing in any given matchup, elemental cards, and you look at those in isolation, pretty underwhelming cards, right? Like the power level on those cards by themselves is not very impressive. Blue Frostfang, we've got yellow Autumn's Touch. Cards like these aren't exactly the most impressive cards. They look like a pile of limited cards that someone's left behind after a Tales of Aria draft, right?
Yeah, maybe that's why they're so appealing to me, because I first got my competitive feet wet in Tales of Aria draft, so I still have very fond memories of these cards. Your point is exactly right. Also, a lot of these cards poor block values, so you can't really turtle up all that effectively when you have a lot of block twos in your deck, and I think that comes up for Bravo from time to time. But like I said, when you hit the Djinn, when you have all three element types, it masks all those weaknesses so well, and your base output gets so high. And that's not to discount Winter's Wail's role in all of this. Like, so many of those blues that we load up our deck with are ice, and just that routine 4 with a Frostbite token disrupts so effectively for such low resource input. I mean, we saw it with Oldhim towards the end of the last format, how effective you are able to leverage those hammers in low resource situations. Bravo does it too. And again, going back to like why I was excited about this hero, just getting access to Winter's Wail with a bunch of different packages, like including the Bravo specialization stuff. So your Crippling Crushes, even when I was first starting working on the deck, my Showtimes, all of those in conjunction with Winter's Wail setup, very exciting to me.
Yeah, and there's one of the things for me for what makes Bravo so impactful in this meta is, there's 40 plus elemental cards that by themselves don't do much, but we know with 3 of those elements in hand, we get to activate the Bravo ability. We know that, like you just said, the power of the ice cards and what they can do for activating that Winter's Wail. There's a few other cards there that are really powerful outside of that, and I wanted to cover some of those. Crown of Seeds, to me, one of the most powerful legendaries in the game in terms of your ability to, not only prevent damage and filter out your arsenal cards, but actually dig towards either those haymakers that you just talked about, or maybe the element that you're missing is really important as well. Alongside with that is Oakenold, alongside, that's Crippling Crush, Oakenold. Those are kind of like the 2 big haymakers, right? The ones that are going to force on-hit effects plus big damage. And then you've got cards that are really, strong utility, but also just powerful cards like Channel Lake Frigid. Make all those ice cards work even harder. And Blink is, really important, I think, in a prison meta where it's dominated by auras.
Yeah, and that speaks to the deck's versatility, right? Those are such just separate cards. They do such different things, but you're able to execute all those game plans within the same game sometimes. It's not even like you're sideboarding, Channel Lake Frigid in one match and Blink in another. It's just like I will shift as necessary, and I can play all the roles as Bravo. And I like that you mentioned Crown of Seeds, but I think, again, talking about the huge card pool that Bravo has, these shields, Stalagmite and Rampart of the Ram's Head, they're so... The fact that I can choose between those two for various matchups, I think they're both incredible in their own way and can just completely hose entire plans. Like, I know Dash evolved to account for Rampart of the Ram's Head, but you can't say that doesn't make a difference. Like even having to give up those slots is a huge deal for them. And I think like you could probably discount Dash as even a consideration in the meta simply because of that one card. If Bravo's going to be the most played hero and Rampart exists, I think that single-handedly closes out a lot of options. So the power level of these cards is just off the charts, and it's in a package that also amplifies all the power level contained in it.
Yeah, it uses synergy well, right? Like you break out some of these cards, they're not as weak as they look by themselves, regardless, and then also you get to roll synergy on top of that. So, and it's not just the main deck cards, like you talk about the card pool. Also, like you say, the shields. There's a big equipment pool. Most of these lists are playing around 10 equipment, including the shields.
10 or 11 sometimes, yeah.
Got a lot of options in terms of how they play into against arcane damage. They've got time skip, but some of them are playing three sets of boots to account for the meta that they're playing in. So no doubt that we sort of feel that Bravo is the deck to beat coming into this weekend, right? It is the top dog. It's dominated ProQuest season so far.
I think so. What's fascinating to me is, and I'm always like big picture metagame game design guy. The question of like, is Bravo too good is so interesting to me. And I want to get your opinion, Hayden, because I really sincerely hope that Living Legend, if this is a problem, we let Living Legend handle it this time. I think like getting that system finally in play, seeing how, Bravo is replaced by the hero that will come after it, should it amass enough Living Legend points. I think it's time to let that system really shine, because I do think it's an inventive and even a somewhat intuitive system for how a non-rotating game should work. And we've sort of used bans, erratas to massage some things before that point. And I think that was good when the meta was not fun to play. Mm-hmm. I think this meta is a blast. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm mostly hearing that from people as well. And even if it doesn't have the diversity that maybe you would dream of, you can't have every hero be viable. Like it's just not realistic. And to the extent it is, what it should be is like a clearly defined top tier and then masters of a specific hero who understand all the tools available and finally have targets to hone in on. Like say a 2-pronged target of Prism and Bravo can say, oh, now that I'm focused on this, I will find my tools and I will beat these two decks. And I think we've seen that happen throughout this ProQuest season.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. This format has been super enjoyable for me. I traveled to 2 ProQuest, but I played 6 in total. There was 4 sort of locally as well. And I haven't had this much fun playing a season like this. Unfortunately, I didn't play a Road to National season just because of things here in Australia. But 4 weeks, a lot of events, were full on. Like I was tired. I had a nice sleep in this past weekend after my last ProQuest, but it's so much fun. I felt the format was really enjoyable. I do think maybe the meta has been a little bit different in Australia to maybe some of the other metas I've seen, where Bravo actually didn't represent as much as it had in other metas. I think it was about a 30% win rate in Australia and New Zealand. So not sure why that meta is necessarily different, but I felt like it was open to a degree. But also, there's clear powerful decks. You want decks to beat. You want to have these decks that they're the targets. But you also want them to be fun. And I feel like these sort of Prism and what Bravo are doing and how they interact with each other is more enjoyable to me than maybe the last format, even though I thought that format was actually quite healthy and quite open. Going to an armory maybe wasn't as enjoyable. So yeah, I think in terms of from a balance perspective, the Living Legend question, yeah, I would love to see that happen. I think we're going to obviously head towards that. I would like to not see a change probably before we head to the Pro Tour. But I mean, that's a different topic. I could get into linear decks and why I think these are good for the game and why I think they're important to have these kind of things. But long story short is I'm really happy with this meta right now, and I'm glad that we have one deck to beat and then I think a second deck to beat as well, which we're about to talk about.
Sure. I'm right there with you.
So Prism is definitely, like you say, that second part of that 2-prong meta that's kind of evolving from the ProQuest season. I think 22% of wins actually through the first 3 weeks of ProQuest, so a little bit under what I just quoted before. But it's a returning favorite, right? With a playstyle that has a bit of a facelift. Traditionally, Prism was seen as this, it's a Herald-based deck that can play these auras and can maybe fatigue people out using these auras. Now we've changed to like this board presence, almost control deck that can be aggro. Like it's very reminiscent of other games and not something we've really seen as much in Flesh and Blood. Yes, we've had items and we've had potions and things like these. But now we have these active, cards that stick on the board and are actually weapons as well at the same time. And the blue auras that have come in to introduce that, these 12 new cards that you can put into your deck, the 4 new blue auras, really change what the Prism deck can look like. And I personally have had a lot of fun playing these Prism lists because they feel completely and wildly different to the Prism, the Illusionist that we saw in the previous meta.
Yeah, so this isn't really like competitive focus, but I still think it's interesting to share my story of Prism. When I first learned the game, it's the tail end of Monarch, so a lot of my first experience is with the Blitz decks, the Monarch Blitz decks, and Prism very quickly stood out to me as a hero that I thought was a failure from like a design standpoint. It didn't feel like an illusionist to me. There wasn't really anything noteworthy about Prism mechanics. Like it just didn't resonate with me. Whereas so much of Flesh and Blood appealed to me because every hero was like distinct and different, and they felt the way they were supposed to feel. Like the brutes were big and hulking, and the guardians were able to turtle up, and all those things like shone through. But Prism never really hit with me exactly right. And then comes Everfest. This version of Prism is so cool, so fun, so much fun to play. I think fun to play against. Like I could see where there's a bit of frustration that can creep in when like the auras are really snowballing on you. But honestly, the games are decided before that point. It's how you're dealing with the auras up until they reach a critical mass. And then yes, there's some like deterministic endings where it's very difficult to get through what Prism has set up, but it does feel unique for Flesh and Blood. It feels flavorful to me. Like it feels like what an illusionist should be doing. And I also think where there will never be a Flesh and Blood deck I describe as low skill cap. I don't think that's a real thing in this game because it is such a low variance game. There is so much planning, not only in actual gameplay, but in deck construction. I just don't believe in that as a concept. But if you were putting things on a scale, Bravo is easier to play than Prism. And I think that's cool that Prism has that skill expression. And it's possible that if you were looking for the real value of these decks, like how good are they actually, I think it's possible that Prism is the better deck. But Bravo's sort of randomness, ease of use, explosiveness masks some of its, I guess just like, I have more belief in Prism being dominant long term than I do Bravo, which is weird to say given how good Bravo is.
It feels less fragile, right? Which is weird because you have this deck, this build that feels like it actually doesn't defend that well, and then you play into it and you realize it does actually defend pretty well. You've got access to cards like Footsteps, and the cards they're very like these blue auras are often replacement level. Like yes, I think Haze Bending is a powerful card, and having that on the board makes a difference, but Shimmers also does a job. Passing Mirage also does a job. At the end of the day, there's still weapons that you get to use and to put pressure on the board, and board presence. Not something that we're familiar with in Flesh and Blood, so I think it's taking time to get used to that. But yeah, I completely agree. I see the longevity of these Prism builds probably being a little bit higher, and I do think that Prism is one of the most. I mean, I played it for 3 pro quests in total because I had so much fun. I only planned to play it for 1. I ended up playing it for another 2 because I had so much fun with it. But I also think it's very powerful and does a job. So I'm throwing a list up here on the screen, and we can look at some of these key cards. So traditionally, some of the I guess the defining factors of these Prism lists is that they're very heavy on the yellows. Around half to slightly over half of the 60 that you're probably going to present as yellow cards, because that allows you to activate that hero ability and then also get go again on those, by using Luminaris to come in with all your auras. These yellows are also threats. You've got the yellow auras, which are the more powerful auras, but they are, they do cost a bit. They are harder to get into play, but they are instant speed. And then the blues. The blue count has risen in these lists recently because of these auras. When you look at it, in actual fact, half your blues now aren't actually necessarily resources. They can be used as resources, but they're also threats. So having that kind of increased blue count is really important. And then very minimal reds, right? Like this is a deck that doesn't want to draw many reds because it doesn't help you pay for your auras. It doesn't advance your game plan necessarily, except in maybe plans where you want to put in a bit of damage, which is really interesting.
I would love to see the red count go even lower, quite frankly. I think one of the things that shocks me about Flesh and Blood deck building, and this isn't to say like I think it's wrong. I think it's something I'm still wrapping my head around, and I'm still like pushing back against to some extent. I think Flesh and Blood decks are often very unwilling to commit to their identity.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is like you see a bunch of D-reacts in a deck that is designed to always be aggressive, essentially. But you go, oh, well, in this matchup, I'll also have D reacts. And sometimes it's right. But I am convinced there's way too many D reacts being played in Flesh and Blood in general. And I also think like some decks do a poor job committing to their plans. And the best Prism decks I've seen have been so heavy on blues, so heavy on yellows, sometimes going as far as like Miraging Metamorph as the only red. I've seen lists like that. I have no objection to that. Like that speaks to what Prism is trying to do. You've got your Arclight Sentinels, you have your Genesis. These are all expensive cards to play. You benefit so much from having blues, and of course, yellow just turns on your entire deck. So, I would see the red count come down even further if I had my way, and I think some people are starting to do that.
Yep, I think this is, like you say, it's this design philosophy where we're taking a lot of blocks, a lot of like almost cookie cutter of previous formats, and saying, well, this is the ratios you need to have. This is like this, it's like an inverse triangle to some degree. Maybe it's slightly lopsided where reds are your power cards, blue are your resources, and yellows are kind of somewhere in between. But the design space is continuing to be explored more, where in Prism, yellows are your power cards. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's such a hard thing to get your head around, and more and more heroes are seeing this. Like look at these Bravo lists. In my opinion, you lean heavier into the elemental cards to make sure you hit that consistency, and that feels like a really weird thing to do because these cards by themselves, in isolation, are not powerful cards. So yeah, the design and deck building, I think it's starting to evolve, and as we get more and more players come into the game and people with different ideas, I think we're going to see, like you say, some of these identities really start to be linked into, and like hero experts really like post for this and say like this is how this should be done. This is where you get the most out of these heroes. So. And Prism is one of those, and I think we're going to see it have a pretty strong showing this weekend. Other cards I did just want to talk about, we're seeing a lot of Tunics over Vestige, and we're seeing Tome of Divinity drop out of these lists in favor of more consistency and this more aura-based plan that's looking to maybe put a stranglehold on the game. Those auras are really key. Merciful Retribution has gone massively up in value. Genesis might have gone down in value slightly. We're seeing Arclight Sentinel come up in value. In terms of like the reds that are being played, you said Mirage Metamorph. We're seeing a little bit of like War Tune Heralds come in for that more aggressive plan. Some D-Reacts and some decks, maybe Unmovables for Star of the Show, but that's kind of been it.
Yeah, I'm fine with Unmovable. I think it plays a very specific role in a very specific matchup. Adding a bunch of Sync Belows to my Prism deck, I think it's just missing the point. And if that's the plan you have to go to, you're doing something wrong somewhere else, is my guess. Yep. And we'll see if that's actually true. The changing equipment in Prism is something I have also found quite fascinating. I've seen like gauntlets at some point. I've seen, like you mentioned, there's the squeeze between Tunic and Vestige of Soul, whereas the Prism equipment set was very defined, I think, in the last meta. You really didn't see a lot of experimentation. And I think that speaks to deck building as well. Everything has a place. Everything has, there's always the best tool for the job. And just because there are unquestionably Prism-focused equipments like Vestige of Soul, it doesn't mean that's actually what the deck wants to do. And, I'm on Team Tunic at this point. It has impressed me far more in my game. So
it's one of the most powerful plays I think you can do with these Prism decks right now is pitch a blue, use a Tunic, put a yellow aura into play, have a 2 or 3 card hand on your turn, and present, maybe even play another aura or end your turn with a blue aura. Like, you're just snowballing, like you said earlier, you're building that board presence, and I think it's very strong. We've talked about the two, what we see is what we talk about these two, and what the data's telling us, right? The two prongs of this format, the big Bravo and Prism coming in, not far behind, and maybe we think potentially even a better deck at this point. But Viserai would be third, and then there's a few, I just kind of want to go through these a little bit, talk about them briefly, and just because they are going to show up this weekend, and they could be a threat. So Viserai was what traditionally the third part of that triangle, maybe is dropping off now. 12.5% of the wins through the first 3 weeks of ProQuest season, so significantly less than the two performers there that we see. Viserai's really changed. In the last format, I played it at my nationals. It was very much like this combo-based deck that had a mid-range plan you could swap into to pressure decks that basically you couldn't combo. Was how it played out. And now it's this it's one of the most explosive decks in the format in terms of the damage it can do from out of nowhere. You can have 35 damage turns off 5 cards out of nowhere because of the combination of cards like Bloodsheath Scalata, Vexing Quillhand, which is new, of course, the Revel in Runeblood, which is new as well, and then you have these traditional pieces of like Sonata and Ninth Blade as well. So still, while it might be dropping off, this deck is really powerful, right? And is there a reason, Bryan, that you think this deck is kind of maybe has it underperformed? Do you think it's underperformed, and if so, why in this ProQuest season?
it's got a huge hill to climb. Like the two best decks are so good. And I don't think, whereas I talked before about when you have targets, you can build a deck to attack what is good in the metagame. I think Viserai is just trying to do it on raw power. Like you mentioned those explosive turns. I don't think Viserai is specifically, like, sure, the deck has adjusted to account for Bravo and Prism, but I don't think the strategy is intrinsically good into either of those decks. It's kind of just like, can I do my thing before you do your thing? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I think it, unfortunately, more often is no. And maybe we got a little blinded by, like you mentioned, those just absurd turns, like 30 damage worth of output very easily early on in the game. And that feels great. But what do you do when you don't get those outputs? And how does it compare to what Prism and Bravo are doing? And I talked about the really high floor of Bravo due to that hero ability. I think the floor of a Viserai turn is sort of a nightmare. Like you just kind of have hands that don't do anything in some scenarios. Where these other two top decks are a little bit more consistent for my money. That's not to say I don't believe in Viserai. I think maybe it's possible that a certain prominent content creator did some things to put this on top of the metagame early on, like maybe winning, say, a Nationals or something like that. And I think that probably put a little bit more focus on the deck than it would have had in other circumstances. It's good. It's just, it's not part of a triangle. It's like a tier. I think there's a big enough gap where I would go. I often use tier 1, tier 1.5. I think Viserai is the start of tier 2. I think there's a big enough gap there.
Yeah, I think it might be. I think I had it probably in tier 1.5 as we headed through the ProQuest season, sort of week 3 and week 4. I think the deck has a lot of power. The big thing for me, you said consistency, and that's the biggest thing for me, that Bravo and Prism have replacement level cards. You know, like I said before, the blue auras generally do a very similar job, even if some of them are more powerful. The yellow auras do it. The game plan is very set. It's the same with Bravo. The game plan is pretty set in most matchups, and then you have some of these cards that come into play. Viserai's turn, the replacement level is non-existent. All these cards are so unique in what they do, and yes, you can piece together really big turns. But first of all, it's not easy to do that. It's a very hard deck to play and to find those lines. And then the replacement level is really low. You know, a Mordred Tide is a Mordred Tide. Nothing else in the deck does that. You know, your Revelant Runeblood is a Revelant Runeblood. Swimming Gloomveil, Rattlebones. I'm throwing up the list now. Like, these cards are all very, very different in what they offer to you. And I think that's the biggest challenge facing Viserai is how do you make this deck more consistent? And that's why I personally, in the last one, preferred the combo plan, because you could build a bit more redundancy and consistency into the list. But now it's a deck that has a lot of moving parts. And although some really powerful parts, like we talked about, let's not forget about Spellbound Creepers. That card is probably the most consistent card in the list and is helping propel it. But outside of that, some of these cards, they really need each other to work and to do the thing that you want to do with these Runeblade lists.
Yeah, this is the same discussion again, right? This is a deck trying to do multiple things. It wants to have access to both of those plans. And like, I get it. It's a nice security blanket to say, well, if this matchup, you know, I don't line up well here, then I'll shift to my OTK plan, or here I'll be more of a mid-range deck. And yes, that is a huge part of the appeal of Viserai. But given how powerful the top of the meta is, I think Viserai kind of needs to settle on a clearer identity. And if like aggro Viserai is not good into this format, or one OTK Viserai is not good into this format, then it's just not the right deck. And mushing the two together and getting like subpar versions of them both, I don't think that's the answer. I think it's a deck that could benefit from a little bit more identity.
Yep, I'm coming around to it as well. Let's see if anyone proves us wrong this weekend. I expect Viserai to still have a reasonable showing. We'll talk about that. We're going to make some predictions at the end. But let's just talk through some of the other lists that we're seeing, some of the other decks and heroes that we expect might show up. I think next on the list would be Chain. We saw, you know, Tarek Patel, who we expect to definitely be there and put up, you know, we're going to see him this weekend, I'm sure. Take Chain to a ProQuest win. I think another top 8 as well. You still have a deck here that is fundamentally very aggressive, has access to Husk, has these really powerful end games that it can set up, and is a one that, you know, has been preying a little bit on Prism. So I expect to see some Chain this weekend.
No, I think so. If Prism trends up, that's a very reasonable assumption. I would even maybe think about slotting Chain above Viserai in my power rankings. Like I feel that strongly about it. I think it does at least have like a really good matchup into one of the big two. I think you can set it up to be very strong against Prism. I think if there is a deck that successfully finds a way to prey on Bravo, there's a good chance that Chain is going to like line up really well into that, because it's sort of like again, just hyper consistent aggressive deck. It's going to do its thing every game. It's going to get to the point where, it's got enough soul shackles where you'll be revealing plenty of blood deck cards in the end game. And if you need to go with a time snap potion type turn at the end of the game, you can do that. If you want to look for some other setups, they're all on the table. And I think that maybe a little underrespected is Chain, whereas some of the other decks are getting too much credit at this moment.
Yep, I think you might be right. And I'm going to use a bit of an analogy from Magic because I know you'll appreciate this, Brian. But I feel like you could have a triangle where Chain is the third part of it. But then you've got like Jund trying to come in. Like, that's what Viscerai feels to me at this moment. Is like it kind of doesn't do anything exceptionally well. People can pilot it to maybe like 50% win rates against,
and we all love it. We're like people, the old heads are like, I'm all about Jund. I look for every possible excuse to play Jund, but I also know a lot of the times I'm tricking myself because I want to feel that level of control over my own destiny. Whereas really, I'm just giving up equity because I want the illusion of control.
Exactly. Yep, I've done that before and regretted it immediately about round 3 when I won 2 drops. So. What about other decks? I know you spent a bit of time with Lexi as a hero, and there's a lot of ways to build Lexi in this format. You can be these like new fuseless kind of builds that look to just propel on-hit effects, ice that really wants to tax. Plus you've got these just aggressive lightning builds, and then hybrid builds somewhere in between. So I expect to see some Lexi, but I don't know what builds we're going to see this weekend. I'm going to throw up a couple of deck lists as we talk now.
Yeah, so I've probably spent the second most time on Lexi of any hero, first being Bravo, and most of my work was on the fuseless side. I think Rain Razors is an incredible print for all rangers. Like Azalea has problems, but like Rain Razors might be the thing that eventually pushes Azalea into viability. I also think Fatigue Shot is such an interesting tool, and it lines up a little bit worse than I expected it to against Bravo. Like I was just like, this is going to be the answer. Like if you consistently fatigue shot Bravo, then they'll be playing at such a low power threshold because their attacks are so initially high. But what that like fails to account for is its attacks are initially high. So even if you like blunt the effect of a pulverize, it's still coming in for 9 if it hits its fusion, right? So that's still devastating. And the clock isn't quite there when you're not maximizing things like the fuse builds. I think that's where a lot of the most ruthless clocks come from, is from the lightning side. And then if you're again fusionless, you're not getting the disruption of the ice side. So I was leaning on Fatigue Shot a lot to cover my back in that matchup. It wasn't quite as good as I wanted, but it left a very clear impression on me that there is something in the Lexi space. There's again a lot of tools. Both ice builds and lightning builds have their merits, and then you just have Rain Razors to kick it into high gear. So I hope someone can figure that puzzle out. I think I lack the Lexi experience to really drill down into the more complicated, like what I ultimately feel will be successful as some kind of hybrid build. And I don't know what that looks like, but being able to have both these game plans, it seems like that's the future of Lexi, and I hope someone can figure it out before this call-in.
Well, we've got a number of Lexi experts, I would say, in North America. We've got Isaac Jessen, who top-aided US Nationals. We've got Canadian National Champion Yuki. Like there is players out there who are pretty dedicated to Lexi, and I would be, I think they'd be the ones that would find it if there is something to find there. And maybe it comes about by kind of ignoring the rune blades. Maybe, you just look at percentage points across Prism and Bravo. Those are your targets, and maybe, like you say, you get to ignore or at least think less about those rune blades, take a few points away from yourself to really hit those top 2 decks, and maybe Lexi can do that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, there's some very clear tools to deal with those top 2 decks of Prism and Bravo. The tools for Runeblade are a little less clear. There, you just want to be like generically good. So if you're able to lean a little bit more into your focus of either, taking out multiple auras in a turn or blunting Bravo's attacks via ice or fatigue shot, I think there's space to do so at this point.
Yep, and that leads me to one of the other heroes that I think is actually pretty underrepresented right now, and that's Briar. And I think the reason for that, in my eyes, is that Channel Mount Heroic is still a card. Briar has a plan. You just talked about maybe Viscerai not necessarily having an identity, Chain having that. I think Briar also really has that. You've got a deck that's really built around Channel Mount Heroic. You've got, I think, a deck that can actually utilize the new cards fairly well in the form of Swarming Gloomveil and Revel and Runeblood to replace maybe some of those cards that are lost in the form of Ball Lightning and Plunder Run to a degree. It's a little bit different to what it used to look like, I think, that shell, but it's super interesting to me what it's doing in this format. I think Bravo is you need to work out that matchup, I think, and maybe it's not Briar's time this weekend because of how much Bravo is going to show up. Maybe you get to skate, get through, you navigate day 1, you get into day 2, there's a lot of Prism, sitting pretty happy playing a Briar deck. I know personally playing Prism across 3 Pro Quests, half my losses were to Briar. Like it was, I think 4 losses across those Pro Quests and 2 of them were to Briar. And that is a tough matchup. And, if you're trying to target maybe what might be the best deck in the format, potentially in the form of Prism, Briar's a pretty good option.
No, I believe you entirely. That makes perfect sense. You just got to figure out that Bravo matchup. And in my own work, I haven't seen many inroads for that matchup. I just don't know exactly what the tools are. It doesn't feel like you can do the pure aggression thing. They can mostly keep pace with that, and then their large turns will invalidate some of yours. And things like Crippling Crush, just blunting your offense out of nowhere, is really backbreaking. They have Awakening as a huge catch-up mechanism. And that's one of the spots where, like, against the pure aggro matchups, that's where I think Awakening is like probably a little under-respected. Mm-hmm. Like, people talk about it a lot in the mirror, but it also bails you out against pure aggro as well. So I want to believe in Briar. I think your assessment of like Channel Mount Heroic is enough, is correct. That card is absurdly powerful, but there's got to be just a little bit more of a plan against Bravo, and I don't quite see it yet.
On board. I think it's might not be the time this weekend, and I think if you want to win Calling Indianapolis, you need to beat a Bravo star of the show at a pivotal point somewhere, whether that's a win in for day 2 or whether it's in top 8 or whatever it might be. Last one I want to talk about, very near and dear to your heart, and we've seen the week 4 of ProQuest actually a bit of a bump in Katsu. Katsu, I know, a mirror match final in a ProQuest in New Zealand, plus a few results through North America and Europe. Katsu's a really interesting one with cards like Even Bigger Than That and 100 Wins sort of changing the way that this looks. It feels very aggressive. It feels like we just talked about redundancy and consistency. It feels like these cards can help enable some of those facets. You get a card in the form of Even Bigger Than That can turn on some of your cards that have conditional go again or don't have go again, things like Snatch, to be more potent threats. And you can play up to 9 Even Bigger Than That's in the list if you can make it work. And it's a card that's very interesting to me alongside 100 Wins, which does a similar job when we talk about consistency of card quality.
Yeah. So there's this weird idea gestating in my head. And as someone who always, like, you've heard me throughout this conversation rail about lack of identity. And for that reason, Control Katsu was always very silly to me. It just didn't make sense. Like, I think the tools were inefficient at doing what it was trying to do. But you start looking at, like, well, what if I just block a lot and I have this like recursive engine with my 100 wins and I can buy them back eventually with my Winds of Eternity, and maybe like there's the Lord of Wind Magenshi release package that's kind of like recursive, and that's the extent of my offense, and I'm just really good at controlling Prism Auras because I have my Kadachis, and then I have space for these D-reacts, and somehow I get like my values high enough in my deck where I can finance Unmovable, or maybe I have even more Flick Flacks, like I'm playing a yellow Flick Flack somewhere to just constantly have access to these big defensive turns. There's like an idea there that appeals to me. I'm not smart enough to make it work. The idea of someone putting together a Control Katsu list that targets Prism and Bravo, it does make some sense to me, and I just wish I was smart enough to do it myself.
Yep. Well, I'm excited to see what we might see from Katsu this weekend. I've thrown up Jack Witzlist, winner of the New Zealand ProQuest. I think it's an interesting base if people are looking for something to start from, and I expect we'll see at least a few people on it this weekend. Whether that translates to results, we'll have to wait and see. All right, Bryan, I want to wrap up, this preview for Indianapolis by talking a bit about some of the players to watch out for, and then just a couple of predictions from us to end it. Let's talk about players to watch for. So, this is a North American calling. We're going to see a lot of players traveling from North America, especially players who, names that we've seen in the game already who are looking to make a run into the first Pro Tour. Plus, we know there's going to be a few international players there. So, I think top of my list to start with, players to watch out for, has got to be US national champion Tarek Patel, who's also had a pretty good season in ProQuest and has clearly been working on his craft. He's been talking about it a lot. He's been, writing about it. I think he's someone that we've got to keep an eye on this weekend as we head into this calling.
Unquestionably, that's the best Flesh and Blood player in America until someone takes the title away. In my eyes, he's got the national championship. He's put up the follow-up results to that, producing content, moving metagames, and has just proven himself to be ahead of everyone else when it comes to this game. And you want to be talked about in the same breath as Tarek, you got to beat him first. Someone needs to step up and sort of put an end to his reign of terror. And I'm interested to see if anyone can do that.
Well, someone that, Tarek himself might actually be chasing, if Tarek's chasing anyone, would be Matt Rogers. And we know Matt Rogers is going to be there this weekend. Former New Zealand national champion, calling winner, multiple calling top eights, and the number one current ranked constructor player on ELO in the world will be there. And I'm sure Tarek will be wanting to get a W over over his friend Matt.
Yeah, and I want to call that match very badly. Like
I want to see
think that's the Morpheus fighting Neo moment where they finally sit down and go against each other. I am hoping we are blessed enough to get that in the booth this weekend.
Yep, me too. Other players I'm looking out for, Michael Feng, calling winner and US Nationals runner-up, is a very good player. I've watched him play in person. He's a very diligent player. Michael Hamilton is another player I'm looking out for. Won the last calling in Orlando, North American calling in Orlando with Old Time. I got to play him in that calling. He gave me my first loss in that calling. Very good player. I think you're maybe familiar with him from SCG days. He was
three-time SCG Invitational Top 8 competitor. That's kind of, if you're not familiar with the SCG Tour, that was the apex of the SCG Tour. That was the end of year championship. I guess there's the Players Championship too, but that was kind of a limited thing. But three top 8s in that tournament is no joke. You're a serious TCG player if you're able to perform that way. And Michael's starting to put together the Flesh and Blood resume too.
Yep, very good. I left my match. I actually said to Michael at the end, I said, I felt genuinely very outplayed in that game that we just played. So, well done to you. And, went on to win the event. So awesome to see. Tyler Horspool, first North American calling winner in the modern age, I guess you could say, with Vegas win on Prism. Will we see him run back Prism this weekend? I think definitely a player to watch out for. He, of course, was top 8 at US Nationals as well. So you'll see him at the Pro Tour later on this year with all the invites that he has. I know he's won a Pro Quest, I believe, as well. Daylon Mack, I know you're keeping an eye out for Daylon this weekend. He just won a Pro Quest. He won an invitational event on the weekend as well, locally in Texas. Plus, I think he's had a few other top 8s with Pro Quest this season as well.
Yeah, having a strong season, and let me tell you, this is a little like behind the curtain peek. Nobody works harder than this dude. Like he just puts in the reps. He says he shoots for 20 games a day, every day. So that gives you an idea of what you have to overcome. And obviously, just like someone who has proven he can compete at the highest level of North American football, one of the most intense things you could possibly do, former NFL player. And the type of tenacity and focus and desire it takes to get to that level, you just can't understate it. And he's putting the same type of work ethic into his Flesh and Blood game. So watch out for Daylon for sure.
Yep. And my last one, I'm just going to give a shout out to my co-host, Brendan Patrick. He's going to be there this weekend. I know he's been putting a lot of work in this week and last week to really get up to speed. And just in terms of
a lot of Prism over on YouTube, I saw.
A lot of Prism. You can go and see him play the ins and outs of that deck. But he's someone that when he really gets into it, his theory from the game, I think, is very strong. And then once he starts to put that into practice, he's a very good competitor. Of course, 2-time calling top 8 competitor as well. I'm excited to see what he's going to do this weekend. We haven't worked together that much this season. We've been on very different schedules. I don't think we've actually played all our games in the past 3 months. We've played on camera. I think it's a grand total of about 10 games. So I haven't seen as much of what he's done this season, but I'm looking forward to seeing what he might do this weekend. Anyone else from your side, Bryan, before we move on to some final predictions?
There's, like I said, there's just so many of my former associates in the Magic space coming to the game now. Matthew Dilks, somebody who I think had either 4 or 5 ProQuest top 8s this season, couldn't quite put together the invite, but just an incredible mind for TCGs. A Viserai aficionado, believes in that deck, so I want to see what he can do. I'm not 100% he'll be there, but I think so. People like Shaheen Sarani is starting to experiment in Flesh and Blood, Control Master from Magic the Gathering. So, he's going to be drawn to like an Oldhim style build and bring his Control Magic over to this game. It's just so fascinating to me to see so many people fall in love with the game the same way I have. And I think tracking those stories is going to be really interesting. And that's not to discredit any of the existing Flesh and Blood players who predate sort of this Magic boom, but these are people who have been around competitive TCGs for ages. They know the logistics of putting in the work. They know what it takes. They know how metagames evolve. They know how people think. And I think that's maybe a little bit of an underexplored aspect of Flesh and Blood right now. And when you're talking about, targeting the 2 best decks in a room, there's a certain class of player who is very willing to do that, and I am curious to see what the Magic folks can do this weekend.
Yep. I think we're going to be making some names this weekend. Whether we do see, I'm sure we will see the household names that we've come to know over the past sort of 12 months through that North American calling season, national season. But I'm sure we're going to see some new names as we head towards Pro Tour number 1. Want to wrap up with some quick fire predictions, Bryan. I'm sure people want to hear this from us, so let's start. What hero will be the most represented? I think for me, it's pretty clearly going to be Bravo's star of the show. Is that the same for you? Any surprises?
It's Bravo. I think just by sheer numbers, sheer quality, I would expect 50% Bravo in the top 8.
Okay. I think Prism is going to have a bigger weekend than what we've seen so far in terms of representation as well. I think we're going to see a real uptick in Prism this weekend. I think a lot of people were maybe playing decks they wanted to through ProQuest season, trying out a few things. I think we're going to see a lot of Bravo, and we're going to see more Prism than we've seen previously as well. What about conversion to day 2? What hero do you think is going to have that best conversion percentage from day 1 into day 2?
It's weird when we have identified the best deck. We're all talking about it. Everyone's focused on Bravo, but its conversion rates are absurd. And like I said, there's no easy decks in Flesh and Blood. Bravo's a little bit easier than Prism. Going to be a little bit more forgiving if there's newer players in the room getting their first taste of a calling. I think it's still Bravo. If anything, Bravo is probably a little underrepresented in this past ProQuest season, which is scary to say given how well it did.
Yeah. I'm going to be a bit contrarian on this. I'm going to say Prism. I think a lot of its bad matchups are not going to show up in the presence, the numbers that we've seen in ProQuest season. I think Chain's going to drop off. I think Briar's going to drop off. I think these more aggressive-based Viscerai decks are going to drop off as people look to gain percentage points against Star of the Show. So I'll go the opposite way. I'll say Prism on that one just so we can be different.
Okay.
Top 8 predictions. What do you think the top 8 looks like? Any idea of? You just said you thought 50% was going to be Bravo. What makes up the other 50%?
Yeah, I am going to shoot 4 Bravo, 2 Prism, and then 2 Dark Horses. Literally anything. They'll just be somebody who brought something, who figured something out. Could be Oldham, could be Lexi, could be Briar. I think all of those are on the table, but I would expect about 75% of our top 8 to be taken up by those big 2. If it's 3-3, that wouldn't surprise me. If it's 4-2 in Prism's favor, that wouldn't surprise me either.
Yep. Okay. I think probably right. I think we might see, I hope we see someone that just comes up with something left field. I don't necessarily expect it. Maybe for the Pro Tour, I would expect that more potentially. I think I'm going to say, I honestly believe in Prism right now. I think it's going to be 3 Prism. I think it's only going to be 2 or 3 Star of the Show. And then I think we get either 2 of these 3, either 1 Viscerai, 1 Lexi, 1 Chain, 2 of those 3, I think is what we see. I think it's going to be a little bit more diverse than we think, just because of how players are going to match up. And how some of these, matchups are important, right? And how we get into day 2. And if I think that Prism is genuinely going to convert well into day 2, I think that opens the door for a few other heroes to maybe sneak into top 8.
No, it's a good read.
What about who's going to win? I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. I'm going to put it on a Michael. I'm just going to hedge my bets. There's 2 Michaels. Okay. There's more Michaels, but there's 2 Michaels I think are very good in this game. Michael Hamilton and Michael Feng. But Michael Hamilton, I had the pleasure of playing him in Orlando. He hugely impressed me with the way he played. And I think he's going to make a run this weekend.
I'm going to pick Dalen Mack. I think nobody's working harder in the game right now. So,
shout out to Dalen. And then I want one last thing. What card is set for a breakout this weekend? I know you're a big fan of Earthlore Bounty. Do you think that's the card?
If I could get people to believe me, maybe I would believe that's
I believe you. No, I'm massive. I'm huge on it.
Yeah, I do think I still continue to believe that is the card with the highest ceiling in all of Everfest. The current metagame is maybe not the best for it. I think you giving up the Tunic Crown of Seeds 5-card hand is asking a lot of the of the Bravo deck. I think that's one of the best things you can possibly do. And so replacing Earthlore Bounty into that slot means that it's always going to be fighting for some space. But in the future, I would be shocked if that's not a huge part of Guardian game plans. For this weekend, though, I'm going to go with Exposed to the Elements.
Okay. Yep.
That's going to be my breakout card.
Yeah, you think very good into Viscerai, good into Prism, a card that Bravo can maybe leverage a bit more than it is right now.
Maybe, and even the Bravo Mirror, you control a Crown of Seeds or, a shield. All those things seem like a pretty huge edge where you can just really benefit from some out there tech, and then you get some edge in very specific matchups as well.
Yep. Okay. I'm excited to see it. I think for me, I'm going to stick on my Prism theme. I think Channel Lake Frigid is a really close second for me. I think that card is I think underutilized. I wouldn't say it's underplayed right now. I think it's being underutilized. I think some of the Bravo lists could have more ice cards than they do. I think Lexi could be utilizing it more. Be haze bending for me. I think this is one of the most powerful cards in Everfest, to be honest. It's so potent in the mirror. It's so strong into this idea of controlling and clearing auras. Haze bending landing is maybe like the third aura you have on the table. It's so hard to deal with because you have these other things to deal with, and then all of a sudden it's getting huge value and continuing to just, push your game plan along. So
no good answers. Once haze bending comes down, there's no good answers anymore.
We're going to see just the power of it this weekend, is how I predict. So anyway, that's our preview for the Calling Indianapolis. Bryan, you're going to be in the booth. I'm super excited to be glued to coverage all weekend. I know you're fizzing to get into the booth and call, your first calling. Before we leave off, how about you let us know where we can find you? I know you're big on Twitter. You've got the Arena Deckless Podcast Plus as well. You're writing a bit of content on your website as well. Do you want to let us know where we can find all of that good stuff?
Yeah, there's the Twitter account at BryanGo, BrynGo. Like Hayden mentioned, I'm writing over at arenadeckless.gg, mostly Magic, but I have put up Flesh and Blood articles there. And I think I want to do some kind of retrospective after the calling. Maybe it's like not quite metagame stuff, but sort of behind the scenes, tell a story, talk about what my experience was like in the booth, and maybe even focus a little bit more on the broadcasting side, because I find the act of broadcasting very interesting. And maybe that's like a little self-involved, but at the same time, like all the presentation and like how you actually decide to put a game before people and make it appealing, it's a big question. And I think like one that Flesh and Blood is still in the infancy of answering. It's still figuring out how it's best presented as a card game. There's no question the appetite is there, but there's some unique things about the game that you really have to deliver upon to make the game clear to viewers. And I'm going to work really hard to do that. How about I throw a question back to you, Hayden? If you could say one thing you want from your Flesh and Blood commentators, like be it an aspect of the game you really want them to highlight or just a demeanor you want them to have, what is it you want when you're tuning in as a viewer from your commentators?
One of the things I find most interesting about coverage for TCG events is what is the story that is unfolding on the board in front of us, not just between the two decks that are being played, because I think that's very interesting, where we are right now, but also the players that are piloting those decks. Do we have a player who plays in a different way? Do we have a deck list that has different cards in it because of a certain reason? I think that's really interesting when we can find out information about that and learn a bit more about what is happening on the table. A lot of plays can be play by play, and that's great, but also the story that's unfolding and what's happening through that match, and the two players and what they're piloting. I think in a game like Flesh and Blood, because of the hero-centric nature and the deck building nature and just the I guess the adaptability of cards is really interesting to me. So if we can get a bit of that, I wouldn't complain.
I think SCG is in a good position to deliver exactly that to you. That was a huge tenet of their Magic coverage. I expect them to carry it forward with their Flesh and Blood coverage as well.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Again, if you want to check out the coverage, I believe it's on Twitch. Is that right, Bryan? On SCG
It'll be on Twitch. I think it's still under SCG Tour on Twitch, twitch.tv/SCG Tour. Not 100% on that though. So check my Twitter, check Flesh and Blood's Twitter. Well. I'm sure it'll be all over the place.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Massive thank you again for joining me to do this. I've had a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to playing this weekend. Thank you, Bryan.
Very welcome.